Yeah, so it's really, really lovely to be here and to have with you all and to have Padmavajra with us. Perhaps many of you will have met Padmavajra before, either here or he lives and works at Padmaloka, the men's ordination training retreat centre over near Norwich, or online. Padmavajra is prolific, I think it would be fair to say, in giving talks, very fine talks. So he is all over Free Buddhist Audio. I can't remember the total, but it's
a rush.
Yeah. So yeah, I asked Padmavajra for a number of reasons. I mean, it's worth asking Padmavajra, for any subject that you happen upon. But Padmavajra has been ordained for 48 years now, yeah, I believe.
Yeah,
I find it fairly easy to remember because it's the same age that I am. So he's been practicing, committed to the Dharma for that length of time. And our subject is life and death in the Dharma. So what I really want to find out from Padmavajra, ask Padmavajra more about, is actually what is the effect of practicing the Dharma on one's relationship with death and therefore life. That's what I want to ask Padmavajra about. So we might stray into kind of Buddhist doctrine on death and rebirth, or we might not. But particularly what I want to ask him about is kind of more personally, in a way, what sort of effect does practicing the Dharma have on this kind of key fact that we all know that we're going to die, so we need to come into relationship with that. Yeah, so that's what I want to ask Padmavajra about. And Padmavajra has lost a number of family members in relatively recent time, lost his dad and his mum and a sister.
And a brother-in-law.
A sister and a brother-in-law, all fairly recently. So what is that like if you've been practicing the Dharma for 50 years? So yeah, that's sort of where I wanted to kind of start, and maybe we'll work backwards a little bit. But yeah, what difference has that experience of losing these family members? Of course, there's Bhante as well, isn't there? Bhante Sangharakshita, who we lost back in 2018. But I'd like to ask you about Bhante a little bit later. But what difference has it made to lose your parents, your sister, your brother-in-law, to how you think about death?
Gosh, that's quite a question. Just say it's lovely to be here. Playing for time. It's very lovely to be here. And I like it. Nice setting. Very nice new setting to be in. I'm just trying to. How can I get into that? I think in relation to family, so I now have one sister left. Obviously, I have another brother-in-law, and I have nephews, and a niece, and my nephews have children, and so on and so forth. So there is that family, but that extended family. But I feel, particularly with my sister Judy's death, that well, I've only got one left. My beloved sister Suzanne. Both my sisters are a lot older than me. I was the baby. They were had very close together, and I was a mistake, which they told me. You're a mistake. You were a mistake, and you had a turned up nose. That was what I remember growing up. It was the sort of family joke, but I wasn't actually supposed to be born, because the sister Judy, who died recently, it was a very difficult birth for Mum, and she was told she shouldn't have any more children. But I think the 1950s wasn't an easy time for, you know, birth control and things like that. So I came along, and I actually asked my mum not long before she died, because it was just, you know, those things you have in families where people say things, and it was, I just thought, oh, you know, this is a funny expression that the girls use. It wasn't said maliciously. It was just a family thing. But I did ask Mum, I said, well, what did they mean about that? You know, that I was a mistake. And she said, well, you were. And I said, well, how did you feel when you were pregnant with me? And she said, very apprehensive, very, very frightened. But she said, you came out very quickly. You were fine. I was enjoying a nice salad. And then I could feel you coming. And then I had you very quickly, and I was just disappointed that the salad wasn't there when I so very typical of my mother to say something like that. I think you can probably gather from this that I come from quite a close family. Even though, you know, we've all, myself and my sisters have lived at different times abroad and so on. And they, you know, they were married, you know, one when she was 19, the other when she was, I think, 20, 21, as people seem to do in those days, and very quickly had children. So I was, you know, I was in a sort of different, it was a different, very different experience to them growing up. And mum and dad were a bit wealthier than they were bringing up my sisters. So I had a lot more freedom than they did, a lot more, in a sense, license, which I think helped me get into the Dharma. However, we were a very, very close family, not without tensions and rivalries and all the rest of it, but a very, you know, typical kind of North London working class family, although I was brought up in Sussex. So very, very close, very, very chatty, very communicative, very neighbourly, you know, that sort of feeling. Family was everything for mum and dad. And you know, so that it was very close in that way, even though, you know, I've gone off and done something so different from everybody else, and that in some ways they didn't really understand, you know, because I left home when I was 17 to join a Buddhist community. You know, I still can't quite believe how I pulled that off, given how, you know, because I did love my parents, and I felt very guilty, and my mum could really, you know, do that thing. She could make me feel very guilty very easily, but I managed to sort of stand my ground. My father had a much more sort of philosophical approach when I left home, when I said I was leaving home to join a community. He just said, when my mother was getting more and more irate about it, he said, let the boy do what he likes. His view being was, he'll come back in 2 years. We were talking, you know, how many, I don't know, decades later when he was in his last days, and he said, you did prove me wrong. So very close, very warm. Although I wouldn't say, you know, mutual understanding, I'm not quite so sure about, but you know, that thing with family is it's very visceral, isn't it? It's very deep, and whatever the nature of the relationship, it's very strong. And when Judy died and I got the news, I was actually in Berlin doing things at the center, and she was in her, you know, she was in a care home, she was dying, and I was getting messages that she was calling out for me. And you know, she was, I think, you know, her mind was sort of going, but she was calling out for me. And her husband was saying, well, my family name is Richard. So she's saying, where's Richard? Where's Richard? And I want Richard. And her husband was saying, he's in Berlin. I know he's in Berlin, but I want to see it, and all this sort of thing. And then I got a message just as I was getting on the plane that she died. And that was and I had a raging cold. So there was this very weird Ryanair journey where I'm sort of half death, spaced out, and I'm thinking of my sister, you know, my sister Judy. And it was very, very strong. And I think, you know, then I got back, and then there was the funeral, which was a wonderfully positive affair, because she was much loved in the neighborhood, and she was very active in the local church, and you know, it was a real celebration of her life, and very joyous. mean, she insisted that everybody wears colourful clothes. So I actually bought a pair of pink trousers, which I've only worn once for that occasion. I've always wanted to wear pink trousers, but there was never an excuse for it. I thought I could do it, but it was I think the thing that started to really dawn on me was, we're coming to the end of this family. You know, there's my sister Suzanne, she's not in good health, much older than me. And, you know, there's just us. And, you know, after Judy died, we were talking a lot about our family, you know, all the, you know, the relationships with mum and dad, and, you know, her and Judy, because they had a kind of quite, you know, again, that visceral thing that goes on. It seems to go on between, well, I don't know if it's all sisters, but certainly my sisters, very different people. And this sense of not just the ending of a life, you know, in this life, my sister Judy, but the sort of ending of a family, you know, the ending of something in that way. And, you know, and that just brought up lots and lots of reflections about, you know, and sort of ponderings about, you know, mum, dad, my sisters growing up, you know, all that kind of thing. All sorts of reveries and reminiscences, and you know, and that's happened every time with when my father died, when my mother died, now Judy. Each time, I mean, first thing, I just think it's just been so, I mean, it's understatement, it's just so moving, you know, that these people that you've been so close to have gone. And every time I've actually found, I don't write poetry, but when I'm very, very moved, I write. And I have to give expression to something. So when my father died, I just found, I was looking through old photographs of him, and suddenly all these lines were coming. When my mother died, after the funeral, I found myself talking to her. She died quite a long time after my father, and I was talking to her and I was telling her about the funeral, because it was the sort of occasion she'd want to know all about, you know, because who was there, you know, what were they like, how did they get on, how were the girls, and, you know, my sisters were much older. And I suddenly wrote her a letter just telling her about the funeral. You know, and it was, you know, which was such an important communication with her, just to, in a way of expressing how loved, you know, she was. And you know, so I think one of the things that's important to mark is that, you know, I have felt sad, obviously, and reflective, although I can't say I can't say that. I mean, I know there's definitions of terms here. I can't say I've grieved. I think more in terms of mourning and honouring. You know, a significant event has happened. Something has changed that can't be unchanged. Loved ones have gone. You can't unmake that. And it's not about getting over it. It's about living with that reality and going into a different kind of relationship with them. I do the Padmavajra every day, and mum and dad and my sister Judy are a part of that. All my family members are. You know, that's never stopped. You know, I feel that you know, the honouring of that relationship, you know, that connection, that bond, you know, just doesn't stop. That, you know, they've made me. They've made a huge contribution to my life. I remember at Padmavajra, and we have birthdays are a big thing at Padmavajra, and we sit round, and whoever's birthday is, there's a big rejoicing. And there was, you know, I was being rejoiced in. Of course, people going through all these wonderful qualities that I have, and I could tell you that that's all true. you know, I mean, you know, which was an interesting experience in itself. Oh yeah, I can, yeah, I'm good. I'm glad you see that. But what I found interesting was that I was also thinking of the people who taught me those qualities. Okay, I might have done something to develop them, but I've thought particularly of my parents and my sisters, particularly to do with things like hospitality, neighborliness, interest in other people. I mean, I come from a family. I mean, if you went to see my sister, well, any of them actually, but if you went to see my sister now, and you know, I've sent friends to give her gift who live near her to give her gifts, and they said, "God, your sister, she's really full on, isn't she?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Well, she immediately starts asking personal questions." And it's fine, but it's and I said, "Oh, that's us, you know, that's our family, you know, very, very quickly. You know, they want to know all about you, what you're like, you know, and they, you know, they really genuinely interested." And I, you know, so I feel quite, you know, and I'm a bit like that myself. I've learned that from them. You know, that wasn't made up. You know, that came from a very neighborly, kindly family. So how has it affected me? In a way, their death, in a way, you know, what changes is they're not immediately apparent. But in terms of their influence and effect, that goes on. You know, that doesn't stop. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sometimes, you know, I feel regret, you know, that I hadn't been kinder. I mean, that's another thing, that I hadn't been kinder, more interested in them, hadn't done this, hadn't done that. Not too heavily, but, you know, sort of regretting that, you know, that there couldn't have been a greater intimacy on occasion. Yeah.
And can I ask, you made a distinction between mourning and grieving, and you said you didn't really feel like you grieved, you mourned. And
well, sometimes when people talk about grieving, it can sound very heavy. I mean, it's definitions of terms, I think. And sometimes people say they grieve about things which I find, like, grieving about that, really? It sounds a bit over the top. Whereas I associate grieving with, I don't know, a sense of, how can I describe it? Well, the traditional way of, you know, you're so attached, as it were, that you just feel this terrible pain at loss. Now, I certainly have felt sorrow at the departure of loved ones, you know, the possibility, if you like, of being in a direct relationship isn't there. But I can't say that I felt I've sort of fallen to pieces or something like that. You know, of course, I do understand, you know, that for a parent, for example, who loses a child, that's a very, you know, or a child that loses you know, a parent too young. I mean, that's a very different thing. I'm just talking about myself. But for me, I think things like this, it's more I want to be more vividly aware of them, not, in a sense, my stuff. You know, for me, when they died, you know, the immediate response is to send love, to send metta, to you know, to support them in their journey, as it were. You know, and you know, when I've done Buddhist funerals, I've said, okay, we feel loss, we feel sorrow, of course we do, but we're here for them. We are here for them, and you know, the traditional Buddhist position is that the consciousness is so sensitive, you know, at the time of death or after death, that it picks up on everything very, very strongly. And if there's a lot of weeping and wailing, that can have a detrimental effect on the consciousness going forward. So in a sense, one has to hold oneself, you know, very much, you know, intelligently. Yes, feel, you know, the loss, the sorrow, but you've got to think of them, you know, and their, as it were, destiny, and supporting their life, their progress. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, non-attachment is or perhaps we'll come to kind of non-attachment, but perhaps before that, you just turn the clock back. So you were ordained when you were 19, weren't you? And how would the 19-year-old Padmavajra have imagined this experience of losing family members, and how the Dharma would sort of
I don't think he would have. No, I don't think he did. No. I think
But you must have had ideas about what it would have been to lose family at that age.
well, I suppose, when I can think of times when, mum would phone up and say dad was going through a bad time, and that I'd be very upset about that, and the prospect that, that he was reaching a point where his health was really beginning to fail and so on. So, and, that happened, I think, a few times, quite a long time back, and that definitely, had a powerful effect on me. In fact, I think I had a brush with the death of my father very early, when I was probably about 4. In our, how families have their kind of family stories, their family myths. So dad's accident. My father was a plumber, and was in charge of, you had to go far and wide to working for a big building company in the southeast. And on a foggy night coming back, he bashed, he went through the windscreen of his van and nearly died, and was away from the home for quite a long time. I can't remember it. And, his face was all lacerated, and, he had to have, plastic surgery and things like that to put him back together. And apparently before that time, I was a very, very carefree child, and very, very close to him. And I can remember, as a little boy, being in the bath, looking up at my dad shaving, with his shirt off, and absolute sense of wonder at this hairy creature, and I probably, in some level, thinking, oh, I'm going to be like that, So very, very close. But apparently, when he came back, I changed. I sort of ran away from him. I started to get very frightened of the dark at night. I started to wet the bed, all those things. And he told me about this years and years later. I must have been in my 40s when we had this conversation. And it was a revelation, and, I thought, oh, crikey, because, my family, they didn't do psychology. They didn't do, they didn't have that culture. But it was, when looking back, I think that was a big condition for me getting into the Dharma. But I wasn't aware of it. I think very early on, on a visceral level, I knew that life was incredibly unreliable. And I think there must have been huge anxiety in the house with mum, with 3 children, wondering, what was going to happen and things like that. So I think there was something there very, very early, but it was very buried. And it was only years later that I started to kind of put things together, because I had fear of the dark. I mean, I would never admitted this. That was going on well into my 30s.
Right. Yeah.
And then the object of fear, interestingly enough, there was a kind of progression in terms of my objects of fear. The dark. As a little boy, I used to scream going up to bed. I was terrified, just of the dark, and then that went on, and then that stopped. I mean, solitary retreats were terrible for me in that period. I mean, because you're in the middle of the countryside, it's dark, where's the mad axeman coming from? This sort of thing. I mean, when I was a little boy, it was the Daleks. I was convinced they were Daleks that lived on our landing, and I'd kind of look for them and things like that. Doctor Who, they did terrible things to me. Daleks, the Cybermen, and the Vords. Anyway. And then the object of fear became death, my own death. Yeah, that became very, very, very strong. And
what age was that?
that probably kicked off in my 30s. It's sort of the dark death. I must say, I think I'm getting less bothered about death. I'm more bothered now about being old and ill and being alive, but not able to do what I do. I think that, and that's not so much an object of terrible fear, but I mean, it is, I just don't want to be like that, you know? Yeah. So, you know, when I was 19, I think there was a buried thing to do with my parents, but it, you know, it wasn't so conscious, I think. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's your evocation of what's come up for you in the death of your family members, of it actually kind of heightening your sense of interconnectedness and gratitude for, you know, realizing that you are not isolated. You're sort of you've been very positively influenced by those members. Is that how you would have imagined Buddhist practice to have affected your relationship with the loss of family members?
Probably not.
So how
because it's hard to think back in terms of thinking about, you know, death and loss of loved ones, but I think actually you've named it very well, that sense of interconnectedness. I remember when my father died, that was, you know, I immediately went down to be with mum, and then you know, stayed there. We had the funeral. I came back to Padmavajra, and I kept getting weird colds, and I couldn't engage with things. You know, I just couldn't engage. And I was talking to my dear friend Arloka, and he said, "That's because you're with your dad unconsciously. You're with him on his journey." He just knew. And I immediately knew I needed to go back and see my mum again and be around her. And he said, you know, by its very nature, it's an unconscious journey. And immediately, as soon as I decided to go back and see mum, the cold went. I mean, it was really weird, you know. So with mum, carried on, you know, helping her, because it's terrible for her. You know, they've been together for decades and decades and decades, you know, and so lonely, so hard for her. Anyway, I came back. I was, you know, actually came back via Cambridge. I was staying with somebody in Cambridge, a good friend, and I had a most extraordinary dream. It was a dream of a horned god. It was in this sort of marshland, and there was this amazing figure, this man with long hair and great antlers, scantily clad. And I didn't feel frightened. I just felt awe at this figure that was starting to recede from me. And when I woke up, I felt my father had moved on. And I talked to a friend, a Dharmacharini, Pragnagupta, and about it, and she was really into pagan things. She said, that's Chernanos, the horned god of the old pagan religion. And one of Chernanos's functions is to guide souls to the happy hunting grounds. So I thought, oh, maybe. And I wasn't aware of this. I'd never seen a horned god, you know, in this way. I mean, it was talk about Jung's archetypes of the collective unconscious. But I felt, you know, I thought, Dad's moved on. You know, he's moved on to his, well, happy hunting grounds or the next stage. And I felt similarly with my mum and my sister. There's a period where you feel an intense, you know, connection, even though they've died. And then at a certain point, it's as if they've moved on. It's not that you let go of the connection, but there's a sense in which they seem to have gone to another place. Maybe they've been reborn somewhere. I don't know. That's all speculation. I find that quite interesting.
So can I start to ask you about Bhante? Bhante Sangharakshita, who died back in 2018. I mean, I think it's fair to say you were a very kind of close disciple, maybe not close in terms of spent a lot of time with Bhante, but nonetheless, your feeling for Bhante, very, very vivid, sort of exemplary. And a lot of people at that time were saying, were kind of taken by surprise that actually they felt with the loss of Bhante, they felt he was just as present, even more present. Some people were sort of saying this. And how did you feel? Was that your experience?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Something happened,
Mm.
and with his death and his funeral, I mean, there was something very, very vivid. There was, a tremendous sort of, I don't know what you call it. I mean, all sorts of happenings were happening on that day. I can remember at Adhisthana, it was a cold, grey day. And I went out into the courtyard, and one of the public preceptors, one of the Dharmacharanis from New Zealand, I think, she said, "Oh, it's really great. It's going to be wet for the funeral." I said, "Don't worry. In a moment, the rainbows will start." And I don't even know why I said it. It just blurted out, and suddenly rainbows were appearing over where Bhante was lying, and people were describing rainbows. They were driving through rainbows to Adhisthana, and of course, what Bhante might say about that, well, the Tibetans would say that's very auspicious at the time of the death and the funeral of a spiritual teacher. He wouldn't, that's the way he'd speak about it. But there were happenings, there were presences, there was a tremendous coming together of the spiritual community. It was very strong sense of unity, and in some ways that there was a sense of presence. I mean, some people went they say, "Oh, now it's now that Bhante's sort of form has gone, it's just his pure influence." And well, I don't know about that, but I can see what they meant. On the other hand, he'd gone, and what I loved about Bhante being alive was that he was alive. And even if I didn't go to see him, I knew he was there. And when I did go to see him, all I needed to do was see him. I over the years, I have had very significant meetings with Bhante. And ordained me, all sorts. I mean, I could go through them, and very rarely in latter years did I go to him for, in a sense, help. He'd given me everything. I just needed to get on with it. But I can remember, towards the end of his life, in some ways it was easier to be, in a way, a bit like Indian brothers and sisters in relation to Bhante. When we were younger, I think Bhante, didn't exactly discourage, but you didn't sort of prostrate or do anything like that. That wasn't the sort of kind of atmosphere, in a sense. But in later years, I think that became much stronger, and I can remember chanting a liturgy with him of a practice that I was about to lead on a retreat, a lineage, it was called Guru Yoga, where you invoke the lineage down to your own teacher, and I asked him to just hold a ball of thread that I wanted to give to everybody, a blessing thread, as I chanted the liturgy. And it was an incredible sort of moment, because he suddenly went into meditation, just sitting there in his armchair, this very old, frail man. He was in this deep meditation, and I'd sort of finished, and I was sort of sitting there, and and then he emerged and gave me the ball of thread, and he said, "I'm thinking of Blake."
Of Blake.
Yeah. I'm thinking of Blake. How does it go? I give to you a golden thread, and you follow it in, and you enter the gate of eternity. I can't remember it. But that was very strong, and a very strong sense of his blessing. And I thought, well, that's gone when he died. Just going to see him taking darshan, as they call it in the Indian idiom, just seeing the teacher, just being with the teacher. Nothing needs to happen other than be with your teacher, even for a few minutes. And that presence is not there. There's nobody who has that presence for me. Now, it's not, it's not that I don't love my spiritual friends. I do. It's, the sight of the Sangha, the Sangha darshana, if you like, is incredibly important to me. But the particular, thing, blessing or whatever you want to call it, that he had, and of course, I'm very conscious of that's a lot to do with my own relationship with him. I'm not saying that everybody would feel that, or making any claim. I'm talking about my connection with him, and I did feel, I have felt very kind of sorrowful about that, I think, because I suppose I feel I prefer to live in an age where I could just sit with and serve a teacher. I just like to do that, really. All this stuff I do, which I do because Bhante, it has inspired me to do it, and I think he'd want me to do it. But in many ways, I'd much rather just be in a monastery or a temple, and just serve a teacher. Just that's all. And be in the presence of that. But that is not my lot, unfortunately. I've got other things that he's very interesting, because his message to me has always been to kind of almost push that back and say, you have to take responsibility. You have to take responsibility for your life. You can do that, and you should do that. And I can remember going back to Adhisthana for an order weekend, after Bhante had died and the funeral had gone over, and I hadn't actually done a lot of weeping about Bhante, and there was a puja where it suddenly erupted. We were doing a puja, and various things sort of went on, and I suddenly found myself absolutely sobbing. But what I was sobbing was gratitude. I mean, I just felt incredible depth of inexpressible gratitude for the man I most revered in life taking me seriously, taking my aspiration as a young man. Well, not a young man, an adolescent, 19. Nobody in, really, is there, when you're 19? But taking me seriously, taking me more seriously than I took myself. And when and since his death, I realize more and more the riches of the Dharma that he has bestowed upon me, directly and indirectly. I mean, it is extraordinary. I've been thinking quite a lot recently about transmission of the Dharma, communication of the Dharma, and reflecting on, which is a whole area that Bhante, so important to him. He talked a lot about it, reflected on it a lot, because that was his life. Seeing himself as a medium for the Dharma and communicating with so much creativity and energy and passion, if you like, to really get the Dharma across and to to people in their place, in their culture. And I mean, in some ways, I feel that his death has meant that I'm just more aware of those riches, and there are more riches to discover. This is what I keep finding. I was looking at an early lecture, The Word of the Buddha, this morning, given in 1972. And I heard that lecture years ago. I mean, it's just astonishing. Absolutely astonishing evocation of the Buddha mind, the enlightened consciousness, and how it starts to vibrate and communicate. I mean, anyway.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? Incidentally, we'll open up for questions at some point, because I'm sure there'll be questions, but we'll probably do that after tea break. But yeah, if you've got questions starting to bubble up, there will be a chance after tea break. But yeah, in a way, you're sort of saying to a kind of different things there, aren't you? Or at least sort of on the surface, kind of different things that actually with the loss of Bhante, somehow that's deepened your appreciation of the gifts that Bante's brought. So there's something very, very valuable actually about the teacher departing.
Yeah.
At the same time, actually, there's definitely a loss. There's some tangible loss, and you would rather that he was here.
Well, yes and no. I mean, because
Right.
that would be, that's impossible.
Yeah.
Because he was very old and he'd done what he had to do, and I hope he's having a good break. Before he, goes off into another Buddha field or something. So you can't hold on in that way. But actually, I think, given what I said, that when I look back on Bante's communication with me in so many ways, there was always this pushing back onto me. Because, you can imagine I'm quite a devotional type. That's my nature. And, but his message was, you have to live this life. I can't live it for you. He never, ever wanted a sort of slavish devotion, not at all, and I've got so many stories where, he just threw me back on myself. Perhaps the most obvious one was in India when he came out. You've probably heard this story many times, where I was in India with Lokamitra when he started things in Pune. So this is the late 1970s, and Bhante came out on his way to New Zealand, and he did 2 weeks of intensive Dharma work. And it was amazing. I'd never seen anything like it. Bhante giving, I'd seen Bhante give talks, fairly big halls in Britain. But, I'd never seen him giving a talk to 3,000 people, never heard 3,000 people chant the refuges and precepts. And in India, they really know how to, do an occasion like this. Buddhist people, before the lecture, big introductions and garlanding, the gorgeous zendu marigolds and jasmine and roses and my job was to gather up the garlands afterwards and put the sandals on Bante's feet and help him to get back into the car, and a tremendous atmosphere. It was really magic, wonderful. But there I did have the opportunity to be his attendant a little bit. So I put up his mosquito net, I wash his clothes, type his letters, make his tea, that kind of thing. And then one night after one of these incredible evenings, I put up the mosquito net, went to leave the room, and I thought, I've got to say something. I've got to say something about, how amazing he is and, how incredible this. And I said, and it came out all wrong. Bhante, I don't know what I will do when you die. And he looked at me quick as a flash. He said, that's assuming I'll die first. And I got the gaze, I got the look, and I was out of that room. So, and the message was, come on, you have to live in relation to your death,
So just to ask you a bit more about this aspect of, you put it in terms of it's Bhante alive that you kind of miss. So what exactly is it? Because in a way you're still serving Bhante, aren't you? I imagine that's very...
in that sense, he hasn't died.
In that sense, he hasn't died.
Well,
and you're still learning from him.
Oh yeah. I mean,
so what is it that's lost?
An actual person. That actually being as close to Bhante as I am to you, and being in that communication, but spiritually, he's perhaps he's stronger than ever. I mean, I bring him to mind every day, and quite consciously. Sometimes he just emerges, and it's always. I mean, for me, if I'm having difficulty in things like meditation or, trying to understand, you know, a particular area of Buddhist practice, when I say understand, go into it more deeply, if I bring him to mind, because I've meditated with Bhante, you know, and I know what it's like to meditate with Bhante. He's the stillest, deepest man I've ever, you know, sat with. And so if I bring him to mind, I start to get concentrated very quickly. You know, that you know, there is this sense of a sort of presence. Of course, this sounds a bit strange for us, but in traditional Buddhist cultures, perhaps especially Tibetan Buddhism, this is completely understood. You know, that you if you have a close relationship with your teacher, spiritual relationship, you know, that you know, bringing them to mind will open things up for you, you know, or deepen things for you. Yeah. But, you know, that thing of actually his particular sense of humor, his particular presence, his sort of, you know, it's like, I mean, you know, I'm still reflecting on conversations I had with him before I was even ordained, and finding that, oh, crikey, I didn't get that, did I? You know, that particular point, he really meant something by that, you know. So all that, you know, that, but it goes on, it does go on, you know. What am I making a fuss about that he's not there? He is there.
Great, thanks. Well, Padmavajra, let's stop there. It'd be good to come back and see if there's more questions. There's another question I'd like to ask you, but so no doubt you've all got questions. But I thought I'd start with a question from Arta Priya. So he just wanted to ask, what do you think happens? We've got the Buddhist tradition, haven't we? But what do you think?
I don't know.
Happens. Short answer.
I've never been there, as far as as far as I can remember. No, it's a big mystery. It's a bit, and of course that's why I think people can be fearful. We just don't know. Yeah, so I don't know. However, I do meditate on that teaching that comes through. You know, it's particularly strong in the old Kadampa school of Tibetan Buddhism. You know, Atisha and his disciples. You know, where they have the 3 root reflections on death. This is expounded by the previous Dalai Lama, the great 13th Dalai Lama, brilliant sermon at one of the prayer festivals in Lhasa, Death and the Bodhisattva trainings. And first thing you need to get into mind is the inevitability of death. You know, that you know, and you really do it thoroughly. You know that it's going to happen, and then the time of death is unknown. You know, it could happen at any moment. You know, in another tradition, you get Dogen, great Japanese Zen master, Soto Zen master, saying, "You are only alive right now, not then, not in the past, only right now." I think that's a very, very good meditation, actually. You know, the inevitability of death, and you're only alive right now, and at the time of death, only the Dharma can help you. And of course, what, you know, the Buddhist tradition is saying very strongly, that they give you all the resources that you need in order to practice. Well, given it could happen at any moment, so why not, you know, really make sure your mind is as clear and as positive and as skillful as it can possibly be, you know, and, you know, there isn't horrified anxiety, excuse me, there isn't shrinking back or rage, or, you know, or turning to your usual sort of distractions. You know, that you're there with curiosity, awareness, loving kindness. You know, you know. So, although I don't know what's going to happen, I mean, I think the teachings about death are about how to live well in the face of that. And again, a reference to Bhante in India on that tour he did. He gave a talk in honor of one of our mitras who'd suddenly died. He was a family man, and just before Bhante came out, it happens in India, seems to happen there more than well, I noticed it happening there more than anywhere else. He suddenly died, leaving a quite big family. And I remember it's the first time I'd seen a dead body, on a funeral pyre. It was all done in the open. It was extraordinary thing going to the cremation ground and, his body on the pyre and, seeing the body go up in flames. So Bhante you have it in traditional Buddhist worlds, you have what's known as a punyana modana, a rejoicing in the merits of the deceased after they've died. And, the family, and friends, they put on they invite people for food and, there's a speech and there's puja and so on, a very positive event. And Bhante spoke on Dhammapada verse 6.
Yeah.
And I had read it before, but as if I hadn't. And it's very hard to translate, but it goes something like, others do not realize that we're all heading for death. Those who do realize it will end their quarrels or will resolve their quarrels. And when Bhante spoke about that, I immediately thought the Buddha must have been enlightened for such elegant, simple wisdom. Those who realize, what others do not realize, those who know that they're going to die will not quarrel. And the only way you can not quarrel is by practicing metta in everything that you do, really. And that had a very, very big impact on me. I mean, it didn't mean that I stopped quarreling with people, but I mean, at least as a wonderful piece of Dharma that is unarguable, really. So although I don't know what's going to happen, these teachings that I've mentioned, I want them to be in my mind in relation to the inevitability of death. Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. And so after for a second question.
God, you're not here.
You know what he's like. Are you prepared? Do you feel prepared?
Oh, no, that's a horrible question. Not enough.
Yeah.
Not enough.
Yeah.
Not there's much more to do in terms of mindfulness, metta, devotion, ethical practice. It's the sort of habitual, nature of the mind. Not enough. There's a lot more work to do. I mean, I turned 67 last November, which, apparently by today's standards is not very old. I mean, when I went to see a doctor a few years back and I said, well, I was sort of saying 65 is old. And he said, no, it's not. And I thought, well, I feel it going. Arguments about that. Yeah. I don't know, as you get older, inevitably you reflect a lot more. And, I have this thing that happens, when I get introduced as, Padmavajra, he got involved when he was ordained when he was 19. I'm feeling increasingly embarrassed by, it's lovely and it's true, but I mean, because I think a legitimate question that people could ask, well, why haven't you made more progress? You started so early, why isn't, why isn't the Dharma pouring out of you and, beneficence radiating everywhere? And well, that's just because I haven't made enough effort, in my life. And I am reflecting on, I've had some health difficulties, which has made it harder to practice, the physical body, interfering, as it were. And I'm having to, try and be more ingenious about how I practice. And I feel that if I'd had more momentum, it would be a lot easier. I remember, again, my dear friend Arloka saying this some years ago, actually, he said he thought quite a lot of order members didn't factor in aging enough in the way they think about the spiritual life and the way they practice. And I think he's right. That in some ways you need to prepare for old age as much as for death. Because it gets more difficult, I think, or it can do. You know, I mean, I'm experiencing it as more of a challenge as I get older. Yeah. So am I prepared? Well, I've got some work to do, I think. I've got a lot of work to do, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, just a secondary question to that. Do you think it's possible to know?
If you're prepared enough.
Yeah.
I can't imagine knowing. Maybe. I mean, maybe. I mean, you know, I think Bhante knew.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, somebody who was very close to Bhante, was one of his, you know, one of his carers. He thinks that Bhante decided when he was going to die.
Right.
He's convinced that at a certain point Bhante just made a decision. Yes, there was some illnesses coming, but he said it was really striking that he just said, okay, we don't need this and we don't need that. And, you know, he did, you know, he was initiated into particular practices to do with, you know, what they call transferring the consciousness after death. I don't know if that was in play, but the accounts of his death are very, very serene. And, you know, almost as if he, you know, he decided, you know. Whereas before, I think before that decision, he was very much sort of measuring his time, wanting to, you know, to keep his energy going for as many people as possible, and quite careful with that. But you felt that he was, and still writing, still dictating articles, and you know, his late work's so interesting. But then at a certain point, I think that's it. Yeah, I've done what I needed to do. I'd like to get to that. I must say, I'd like to get to that. Yeah.
So I wonder.
I think my ambition, though, if I'm honest, what I'd really like, I'd like to be giving a Dharma talk, a really inspired one, and either at the end of it or in the middle of it. And that's what I'm talking about, death.
Sort of Zen.
Better be careful what I wish for.
Great. So we've got just a little bit of time to see if there's any questions kind of bubbling up. Prakash.
Okay, hi. Thank you for the very personal talk earlier, and I hope my question's appropriate. It follows on a little bit from Artapriya's first question, difficult one, what happens after. So one of the things I was wondering, there's these terms which are rebirth and reincarnation, and I wanted to know from your, sounds like you've done quite a bit of studying, where do these terms fit into the Buddhist perspective, and what do they mean?
Okay. Well, reincarnation isn't really a Buddhist term, because it would imply that there's a sort of permanent essence going from life to life. And, you know, in the Buddhist tradition, you know, with the Buddha's teaching, well, there is no sort of permanent, unchanging self or soul. What there is, it doesn't mean there isn't a sort of inner life, as it were, but everything is a becoming, you know, ever changing. There's a continuity, you know, in dependence on this set of conditions arises another set of conditions. And that process goes on even when the physical body passes away, and it moves into another, you know, it finds, or it emerges as another embodied being, and you know, in accordance with, you know, one's actions in this life, that will determine the next re-becoming, as it's technically called. Yeah, that would be the term, because there is this thing, you know, it's not about a soul, you know, a fixed soul sort of, you know, going through lives. It's more that there's, you could even say there's energy. You know, there's sort of flows of energy that take new forms and so on, depending on how you've lived, you know, in this life. Yeah. And I said, you know, in terms of preparation, I do strongly believe that the kind of momentum that you set up in this life, you know, whatever happens beyond. And I've got no personal experience of rebecoming, so I take it that's what the Buddha's teaching, and so I accept it in that way, but I can't prove it. But I do tend to think, yeah, I want to sort of live with a positive, creative momentum that will carry on into the future. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Prakash. Any other questions? But
Thank you. Michael. I was struck by the fact, sort of quite early on, you said that you were less frightened of death than kind of protracted old age. Actually, where you're less capable. That's sort of, maybe a thing that sort of modern Buddhism needs to address in a way that it never did before. Actually, there were lots of people that for a lot longer actually than physically able. So, can you say anything more about your own approach to the possibility of?
I'm not sure I can. It's interesting. We talk a bit about it at Padmavajra now, where I live, because some of us are getting older. So there's quite a lot of discussion, and it's the younger ones who keep bringing up, well, what are we going to do with you when you can't do all these, all this activity going for refuge, and they mean it in such a kind way. So, I mean, I would like, I hope that I can be around people younger than myself. Because I think one of the sad things about getting older for a lot of people is that they're not around younger people. They're all put together, aren't they? And I think there's so much stimulation to be had from youth, comparative youth. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in older people, whether or not they've lived a spiritual life. There's a lot of history, a lot of knowledge. And I think if with the right sort of approach, they can give that. I mean, one of the regrets I have is not talking more with my parents about their own lives, living through the Second World War and, all the kind of, the times I did do that, particularly with my mum, was a kind of living history lesson, and so on. So, I mean, I hope that what will emerge is that and it is emerging, I think, a bit, where you have people coming together of different ages, and then you have all that stimulation. So that's just one response. Yeah. I mean, also, I mean, there's a friend of mine in Norwich, an old friend who's, really entering a quite helpless old age, and it's lovely to see the way the order members, some of whom don't know him that well, the way they're helping him and, to find a way forward. Yeah. And, that's what we'd hope, and that's what we'd expect. Yeah. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said. I know that there have been order members thinking about sort of Buddhist care homes and things like that. And, but I don't know how much they've developed. And there's the Trirantna Trust as well, which was set up with the explicit kind of as a charity to help I think particularly order members in need, with health needs and including aging order members. Yeah, there's work to do. Yeah.
Great. Hi, Julia.
You were talking earlier about that time when someone passes, that period of time. I was wondering if you could speak more about that. What's your experience of perhaps holding that space from a Buddhist perspective?
It's been more. I mean, that was. It's interesting, isn't it? That it's not just the Tibetan tradition. The Tibetan tradition is based on an old Indian tradition. They say there's a kind of 40-day period, which they call the in-between, the Antarabhava or the bardo, between life and death. That what happens to the consciousness, whatever you call that, it goes into this sort of period of between the end of this life and the beginning of the next life, and it goes through all sorts of visionary experiences, and it goes on a sort of journey, depending, and this is what the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead is about, this sort of in between. And the experience I had particularly with my father, and it was also true of my mother, and to a lesser extent with my sister, there was a definite period. With my father, it was exactly 40 days, which is kind of interesting, where I felt he was around and then he went. But I can't say it was, you know, and I don't think it's a strict 40 days. I think it's really out of time. But I think, you know, I think that's in traditional cultures, that's what you do. You know, you know, people here, modern life, it's like somebody dies, okay, let's organize all that, and you know, you have the funeral, life moves on. Okay, I'm generalizing. You know, I don't want to say that's true of everybody, but my impression of traditional cultures, you know, there is time given to, you know, somebody's death. Okay, you know, like in India, the funerals happen quite quickly. It's a hot country for very obvious reasons. But then you have this whole period, you know, well, some weeks later for this Punyana Modana ceremony. So, you know, there's this sort of marking of the person, you know, whatever the status of where they are. And I think that's a much more healthy culture, a culture that honors the departed, I think is a very healthy culture. You know, where people give time to that. Yeah. So if anyway, my experience of it, yeah, all I can say is that with people I've been very close to, after they've died, there's been a period where there's quite a vivid awareness of them. Although in my father's case, it was quite unconscious and it was making itself through strange physical symptoms. And you are sort of with them, I think. But I think being with them is as much for you as it is for them. Yeah.
Great, Sudipta.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for doing that. Did you tell us about your personal connection with Bhante? For me, Bhante and Dr. Ambedkar, they're like spiritual parents for me.
Yes. Yeah.
Dr. Ambedkar has given us Buddhism. Bhante taught us how to walk on that path. See, in my culture, in Indian culture, so basically what happened like within family, if elders died, we would like to follow their wish. And for me, I mean, Bhante is like, you know, sort of spiritual parents. And if you want to express gratitude towards him, what will be the best thing to do? How we can express gratitude towards Bhante as a teacher?
Yeah. Well, I think what the traditional position would be, well, you practice what he taught and you communicate that as widely as you can. You know, I think that would be a very traditional response to the, you know, the death of your teacher and the expression of gratitude. It isn't sort of, you know, turning them into a sort of divinity or something like that. It's much more to do with, you know, what Sangharakshita, what Bhante lived for was and gave his life to was, you know, studying and practicing Buddhism, but communicating it as vividly and as fully and as vigorously and as creatively as possible, you know, and as boldly as possible. And I think that is what he would like, you know, that was what he would love, you know, when he was always delighted when he heard about somebody taking the Dharma into a new place. You know, he was always pleased, and it wasn't to do with self-aggrandizement. It was to do with, you know, his deep, faith in the Dharma, that the Dharma can really liberate human beings, that it can really enable them to develop and grow in a meaningful way. And so he was so pleased when people, you know, took that up and, you know, lived from that and communicated that. And, you know, you know, so, I mean, that's why I think I am still serving him, if you like, or I am serving him, because, you know, that's what I live for. You know, that's you know, that's what I live for now, you know, is communicating the Dharma as much as possible. And I think it's very important to remember that we barely started. We've got a lovely centre here, and it's been here a long time, but, you know, we're very young as an order. You know, we're not 100 years old. And, you know, okay, we're reaching, you know, good people. But, you know, this is you know, there are many, many people we don't reach, many parts of society we don't reach, many cultures we don't reach. And it's not, there's nothing wrong with the Dharma. Well, there's nothing wrong with what we're doing, but we've got to be much bolder, more imaginative, more creative, more adventurous in how we get that across. Finding ways of getting it across. I mean, when I was in India, I remember writing to Bhante and telling him that I'd gone to a particular district in Maharashtra, Sindhu Durga, you know, down the Konkan. He said, "Oh, I've not heard of that. Can you tell me more about what you saw?" And he was very excited, very, you know, the whole idea that the you know, and then I was able to say, "Oh, and not only did we teach in Sindhu Durga, we were asked to go to Goa to teach the Dharma." And myself and Bodhi Sen were the first order members to do a Dharma talk in Goa. We didn't go to the beaches. You know, we went to the public library in Panji, and under a murti, an image of Saraswati, I gave a Dharma talk. Yeah. And he was really, you know, Sangharakshita was just so pleased. Yeah.
Maybe just one or possibly two more. Yeah.
Hi. I'm just wondering what you think about the idea of praying to Bhante.
Praying to Bhante. Oh, that's interesting. Well, sort of praying sort of generally is an interesting area, isn't it, for Buddhism? I mean, you do have it in Buddhism. As praying to Bhante. Well, you find it in Tibetan Buddhism, especially. They call it what do they've got a particular name for it. Prayer is, it's more like you make an aspiration that you ask your teacher, you ask the lineage for blessings to develop in a particular way. So it's sort of like that. It's not so much that you're sort of petitioning. It's more that you're bringing to mind your teacher or the lineage of teachers, and you're asking them to sort of witness or bless what you're trying to become. You know, because they can't give you the qualities that you're trying to develop. You have to make the effort to do that, but you can, you know, bring them to mind to witness that and to support you in that. That's a very strong in Buddhist tradition. Sometimes I have chats with Bhante. I sometimes, if there's something on my mind, I imagine going to him and putting it before him, but I then have to really sit back, because my experience of going to him was that what he'd reply would be so unexpected, you know, and even maybe quite low key. So it's very hard to anticipate how he might reply, but it's quite an interesting exercise to have that. I mean, again, because of, you know, the way he was with me, I mean, it's usually something like, well, you know the answer to that. You know, that's what I get back. You know, you sort it out yourself. That would be the sort of the message. Yeah, but you know, the whole thing about praying sometimes, in the order we meditate on particular Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and somebody was asking Bhante about praying to their Bodhisattva, and Bhante said, well, if you feel moved to do that, do it. Work out the metaphysical implications later. You know, how it fits in and all the rest of it. Yeah, I think you know, but I you know, there have been situations where I've been in where I feel very unequal to what is demanded or expected of me. And I in those situations, I've sometimes sort of, as you know, metaphorically, as it were, sat back and I've said to Bhante, to Padmasambhava, to the Nija, I can't do this. Can you do it, please? And it usually works. I mean, because what it does, I've become super mindful. I remember going into a meeting that I knew was going to be incredibly fractious with all these heavy hitting order members and all. I'm really not equal to this. This is going to be a punch up. I mean, not literally, but and I just said, look, you know, Padmasambhava, look, Bhante, can you just do this? What it instilled in me was this incredible vigilance, you know, just this real awareness of you know, just keeping an eye on what people were saying, being very mindful about what I was saying, so that you just sort of headed off, you know, something that could lead to difficulty. And so I think if you have a very strong feeling for your teacher or a Buddha or Bodhisattva, when you bring them to mind, you get that vigilance, you get that awareness, you know, sort of lifted up, and you know, it inspires that in you because you know you're imagining somebody on a higher level of consciousness, but when you imagine that sort of transmits to you. Well, the fact that you can imagine it means there's something of that in you, you know, otherwise you couldn't imagine it. Yeah.
One last question, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
What are your views on assisted dying?
On
Assisted dying
oh,
from a Buddhist view?
I must admit I've not thought about it, so I'm not sure I can answer that. You know, I you know, it's obviously quite an emotive area. Gosh, so I haven't, I can't really answer. I think I haven't thought about it because it, you know, it's such a loaded area, isn't it? But
Because
yeah.
for me, I think what I understood is, of course, the Buddhists forbade killing, and suicide is a way of
Yes,
killing.
yeah.
But I've also read before where arahats, I think when they are in immense pain, they do kind of commit suicide. I don't know whether it's a
Well, there is a teaching, you know, the Buddha, there's there's two things I can say. Generally, suicide is seen as, you know, a violent act. You know, killing yourself is, you know, it's not a good thing to get to that point. And the concern is what will happen in the next life. You know, is that actually really resolving anything, or are you actually just going to go on in, you know, in this sort of position? I'm conscious that, you know, I've never sort of been with somebody whose life has been so difficult that they've taken their life. So I'm in that sense, I'm out of my depth. But the concern would be what would happen, you know, with that future life. But as you said, there are stories of enlightened or on the way to enlightenment people who are in so much physical pain, they decide that they end their life. There's a very famous, perhaps the most famous example in the time of the Buddha is somebody called Vakali, who seemed to have had a very, very painful life, very, very devoted to the Buddha. And he wanted to take his life, and he did. And, you know, it's quite a mysterious story as well, because after he takes his life, the Buddha points to the sky, and there's this sort of cloud, this dark cloud swirling around in the sky. And he says to the monks, "You see that? And they say, yes, he said, that's Mara, Mara, the, conditioned existence, the embodiment of that, trying to find Vakali. But Vakali's gone to the place beyond birth and death. He can't be found. So he's liberated. So, suicide is permitted under those circumstances. But, how do you know you're enlightened? That you have to be careful. Yeah. I think, but this is such a big topic, isn't it, now? Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm mindful that Padmavajra does need to get back to Pavloka, and so maybe we'll finish the question answers there, and just say thank you very, very much,
Thank
Padmavajra,
you.
for coming over and giving us such a full sermon.
I must say so. Very, very good questions.
Oh, good.
Wonderful questions, and more wonderful questions. Really, not an easy topic, but I felt very comfortable, and thank you. And actually, I discovered some things about myself that I didn't know when we were talking. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Lovely. So Kula Priya is going to lead us just in the last 20 minutes, just give us a meditation or possibly a mantra. I don't know. Anyway, he's going to lead us in something just to finish off the evening and allow Padmavajra and Akashija to head home.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.